Thank you for being here on this warm summer afternoon. The weather, the heat, is much like it was in Hiroshima on that morning 67 years ago that the bomb was dropped. We're very honored to have present with us Kikuko Otake. Thank you so much for being here. Kikuko Otake is a survivor of Hiroshima. She was 5 years old at the time the bomb was dropped, and she will share with all of us her memories of her experience those many years ago.
Thank you very much, David, for a nice introduction. Where is Deborah? Thank you, Deborah, for helping me. And Rick, Carter, and another Rick. Where are you? Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Kikuko Otake. I'm a Hiroshima atomic bomb survivor. 67 years ago today, August 6, 1945, I was 5 years old and lived 1 mile away from the hypocenter when the world's first atomic bomb exploded over Hiroshima. I lived with my mother, Masako, and 2 brothers. It was a very, very hot day on that day. Around 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, please think, in Japan, we don't celebrate daylight savings times. So 8 o'clock in the morning was something like 9 o'clock in the morning for us. And then around that time, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, my mother went to the backyard and saw a lady who was walking on the street with a white parasol in her hand. But she went back to the house and continued to do laundry in the kitchen. My older brother was a 2nd grader, and it was the last day to go to school. During the war, school schedule was so different. And from the next day, the summer vacation was supposed to start. So he left home to school, but air raid alarm sounded, so he came back home. That was the alarm. See, the B-29 flew over Hiroshima, and that was the weather plane. And the weather plane, that B-29 radioed that the sky over Hiroshima was so clear, no cloud cover. So that was the time the fate of Hiroshima was decided. But because that B-29 flew away, the alarm had been cleared. So my older brother was supposed to go back to school, but he was too lazy to head back to school, lying down on his back and in the living room, and he was reading a comic book. My younger brother and I were playing house on the street just in front of our house with my cousin who lived next door. To fetch a spoon or something, I ran back to the house, and my 3-year-old brother also followed me. It was at that time, at 8:15 in the morning, the atomic bomb exploded. It produced 280 meters huge fireball, and it released tremendous amount of radiation and extremely high heat rays. That heat rays reached even on the ground in the vicinity of the hypocenter, it reached 7,000 degrees, some say over 9,000 degrees. And please remember, the melting point of iron ore is lower than 3,000 degrees. With those very high temperature, people around the vicinity of the hypocenter were incinerated or even vaporized. Anything that was flammable within 2 kilometers of the hypocenter spontaneously caught on fire. That means anything flammable. Most of the Japanese homes were made of wood, so the old houses started to burn. But anything flammable included people's clothes. So people's clothes caught on fire, or that also includes people's hair. So people's hair and eyebrows and eyelashes were incinerated. Many people became bald and naked. It also produced a tremendous amount of shock waves. That blast force was of 1,000 miles per hour. That is something like going from here to Texas in 1 hour. Because of that blast force, our house crashed down over us, and all of us had been buried in the crashed house. Everybody was knocked unconscious for a while. My mother regained consciousness, and she pushed off the debris and went out of the crumbled stuccos and roof tiles and so forth. She freed herself over the rubble, and she found my younger brother and I were buried up to the chest in the rubble. She crawled across the debris and pulled both of us free. She looked for my older brother, and as he was reading, he was lying down on his back. Everything crashed over his body and face. And then somehow he also freed himself by pushing off the rubbles. But even the small comic book must have helped him a lot. But he injured his head and eyebrows, and a huge cut along his nose, and his left eye was covered in blood. My younger brother and I also injured our head, and then the blood gushed like fountain, she said. Because all three of us children were bleeding, my mother dug through the rubble and found the first aid kit. Around that time, everybody kept a first aid kit handy. And then she put out a triangle shape cloth bandage, and she tied all of our children's head like this, so like covering our head with bandana. But she couldn't stop the flow. She felt something coming down, and then she wiped her forehead like this, and then she found her palm was covered in blood. It was at that time that she realized she herself was also injured. And just below her left elbow, a big gash of about 4 inches, and then she could see some bones also. Because of that blast force, our kitchen window was shattered by the blast, and the fragments of glass flew like arrows and stabbed to her head and face and shoulder. She found more than a dozen glass fragments stuck into her face and cheek and so forth, and then she pulled out some of them by herself later. Because of that high heat, fires were started everywhere. So she decided to flee with 3 bleeding children. But there was nowhere to flee because everywhere, entire city of Hiroshima started to burn. The river was the only place that was not burning. So she took us to the sandbank of the nearby river. There she found my uncle who lived across the street of our house, but he was in the backyard with bare-chested because it was so hot, and he must be standing right facing to the heat rays. He was burned, bald, and his face skin was sagging down, and his chest was red with sloughed off skin hanging like paper streamers, and he held out his hands like this, and the slipped off skin was hanging down from the fingertip like latex gloves, and he crumbled and died. It was as dark as night, and it was such a hot morning, but the temperature dropped so low, and it was shivering cold. And soon, the black rain started to fall. The raindrops were black because it contained soot and dust, and also that rain was highly radioactive. We didn't know about that, and then my older brother opened his mouth and he drank some raindrops. That night, all my relatives, my mother's side and father's side, all of us lived in the city of Hiroshima. So we didn't have any home any place to go. All of our homes, relatives' homes, including my home, burned down. So that day, we slept on the sandbank that was soaked with black rain, and we couldn't take out anything with us, so we didn't have any futon or even sheet to cover. So without a cover in open air, we tried to sleep on that night of August 6th. It was so cold because our clothes were shredded and dirty and stained with blood, and that blood hardened, caked blood, and then it was so hard, but with injury, with streaks of blood that dried out and so forth. We tried to go to sleep on that night, but we couldn't. But anyway, for the next 2 weeks or so, we didn't have anywhere to go, any homes to go. So we spent every day for 2 weeks on the sandbank. In the meantime, we went to the vicinities of the hypocenter where looking for my father. My father was a pacifist, but he's been drafted to the Japanese army, and his unit was stationed very close to the hypocenter. And on that morning, his unit was out in the open doing morning exercises. That drill ground was mere 500 yards from the hypocenter. We looked for him, but we couldn't find him. And because we spent so many days and then we roamed around the hypocenter, we came down with radiation sickness. About 2 weeks after the bombing, all of us came down with radiation sickness. That means atomic bomb syndrome, because it includes injuries also. But we suffered from severe diarrhea, extreme fatigue, vomiting, and my mother lost most of her hair. But towards the end of that year, December of 1945, somehow we regained our health. However, because we didn't go to doctors and then we didn't get much treatment, all our injuries self-healed, let them self-heal. So we didn't have plastic surgery. So all of us had scars, and my mother has a big crescent-shaped scar below her elbow. Originally, she was told by the doctor to amputate her arm, but she could save her arm, however, the big crescent-shaped scar here. And then because of the glass stab wound, her eyebrow was cut, and then she had some scars on her cheek, and her upper lip was kind of had a scar. My brother, my younger brother and I still have a scar here, but you cannot see it. My older brother had a scar on his head, and then his scars are most visible because of big scar on his forehead and kind of a scar above and below his left eye, and then kind of skin was pulled. His left eye was saved, so no injury, just here. But because it was, skin was pulled, he couldn't close his left eye. And even these days, when he's fast asleep, his left eye opens a little bit. But all of us recovered, but we couldn't find my father. And of course, he's been dead, but because we couldn't find his body and then we never had the funeral, technically he's still missing. And we still don't have a closure. And Sadako lived 1.7 kilometers away from the hypocenter, exactly the same distance away from the hypocenter where I lived, although in different towns. And she was 2, I was 5. She didn't suffer any injuries, but I did, and I also suffered from radiation sickness. But as you know, 10 years later, she came down with leukemia. Just like she did, I made a paper crane. Okay. And then I wrote peace on its wings. Okay. Nuclear weapons should be abolished. There is no other way of surviving but peace. Okay. Let there be peace. Thank you.